So I've always been a very visual person and quite an artistic person, but that came into its own when I got to university. Because if I'm being honest, I got a little bit overwhelmed at the sheer amount of information that I had to take in as part of my biology degree. And I ended up using my artistic skills, using my love of drawing and creating as a sort of way of getting through, as a way of coping. And so it ended up with some slightly epic, slightly weird things at times. So the image on the left is a pretty life-sized outline of the human body, into which I wrote and drew all of my physiology notes in my first year of university. And the image on the right is a plasticine cat and a cockroach, because I was trying to learn how animal gait and animal walking worked, and was struggling to deal with this from a sort of purely mechanical text basis. So created myself some plasticine animals, and walked them around the library, much to my classmates' amusement and slight despair at times. Many years later, I am now a freelance illustrator. A good chunk of my freelance work is illustration, and I use visuals to tell lots of different stories. The image on the top left is of a fox that has sort of the phases of the moon along its back and stars in its fur as well. That was created to represent research that shows that the size of foxes in different geographical regions correlates to the length of night. So generally foxes in Scotland tend to be bigger than foxes in England, for example. The image on the bottom left is a cartoon of a very angry pair of lungs holding an inhaler. And that was a very personal one to show how my lungs quite often feel. The image on the right is taken from a popular science book called Handmade by Anna Pshaisky, which is about material science and how that intersects with crafting. And this was from the chapter about paper making. It shows a pair of hands pulling a decal or a frame that's used for paper making out of a bath of water. But within the frame are embedded the words love, someone, Sappho, heart, and feelings, which sort of hints at the material that's coming later in the chapter about how for Anna, paper and reading and writing were integrated with how she discovered her sexuality. So I think visuals can be used in lots of different ways to talk about science and other research in lots of different ways as well. So before we sort of delve into the meat of today's session, I want you to do a few warm-up activities, which hopefully will get you producing some visual information yourself, but also in a way that hopefully means that you don't feel like too much of a perfectionist for the rest of the session. The point of these activities is to take part, not to produce anything that is particularly wonderful or particularly artistically wonderful, I think. So I'd like you to get yourself a piece of paper. It can just be in a notebook or a scrap piece of paper, and a pen or a pencil. And I want you to find something that you can see that you're going to draw. So that could be your computer, it could be your laptop, it could be a pot plant, a lamp, a mug, just something that is within your eye line at the moment. So then you're going to get your piece of paper, and I'm going to give you 1 minute to draw that object when I say go. But the trick is, I don't want you to lift your pen or your pencil off the page at any point during that 1 minute. So you're going to draw the object in a continuous line. Your 1 minute starts now. Okay, stop. Now, I hope you've got something in front of you. It probably doesn't look exactly like what you were drawing. That's not the point. The point is to think about what you can see and to put that onto paper. So we're going to do something similar again. This time it can be the same thing that you drew before. It could be a different object, or it could be something that you pictured in your head. Anything at all that you want to. You can have 1 minute again, and this time you can lift your pen off the paper, but I want you to use your non-dominant hand. So if you are left-handed, use your right hand. If you are right-handed, use your left hand. If you are ambidextrous, choose, or maybe continue with the continuous line to give yourself a bit of a challenge. So your 1 minute for this second activity begins now. Okay, stop. Now, one more exercise I'm going to get you to. This time you can use whichever hand you want. You can lift your pen off the paper, whatever you'd like. And I'm going to give you 2 minutes. But within these 2 minutes, I want you to draw as many things as possible that you associate with your research. We're going for quantity over quality here. They don't need to be perfect. They can be abstractions. So you could draw a box to represent a computer if you wanted. But I'm going to give you 2 minutes and as many things as possible that you associate with your research or your job if you don't work in research. And so your 2 minutes start now. Okay, and time's up for that activity as well. Here is an example of what I drew. So I sort of did things associated with my work. So there's a laptop, scissors, a DNA helix, a microphone, and lots of other things in there as well. And just in case you're interested in the other activity we did, that was my continuous line drawing of a plant, a pot plant that's on my desk. And that was my left-handed drawing of the same pot plant. Okay, so I'm now going to get you to draw something else, but this time I'm going to describe to you what I would like you to draw. Now, I have in front of me an image and the list of words that I'm not allowed to use to describe the image. And I want you to draw what you think I have in front of me. So I'd like you to draw something that looks like an egg shape, but it's symmetrical. And then within that, I want you to draw another similar shape in the middle of it. Then I'd like you to draw two lines, one going from north to south, and another one going from east to west. So crossing over the two shapes that you've already drawn. I'd then like you, within the smaller egg shape, to draw a diamond shape where the 4 points meet the lines that you previously drew. And then finally, I would like you to draw a line going from the right-hand side of the diamond in a northeast direction. And then another one going down in a southeast direction, and then mirror those on the opposite side of the shape. Just give you a little bit of time to finish up with that. So this was the image that I was trying to describe. And the words that I couldn't use were triangle, circle, square, and oval. And the idea behind this exercise is to show that trying to talk about something when you're not on the same page can be quite difficult, especially if they're terms you can't use because they're jargon that you use on a day-to-day basis that your audience may not know. So you're having to find alternative ways to describe it. And trying to place yourself in a position where you aren't entirely sure what's going on with something can be quite useful. And I'd recommend, if you are going to be in the same place as colleagues or any other people soon, maybe trying to do this activity with someone else in person where you're describing it. So this applies to like any form of communication, but I also think that it can show why visuals can be quite useful for bringing everyone on the same page. It would be a lot easier for me to talk about this image when we can all see it together. And that brings me on to the first reason why I think visuals are really important for communicating and as part of storytelling, which is to add clarity, to clarify things. Visuals can be really important for adding that additional information and for clearing up information, but that doesn't mean they need to replace text or to replace audio descriptions of things. So this is an example. It was a graph that I drew to accompany some text, which was about figuring out when two cable cars were going to cross, at what height they were going to cross. And the text on its own would not have made complete sense, and the image on its own doesn't make complete sense, but together they tell a story and they allow the reader to be in the same place as the writer and to think about this problem. A diagram that people might have seen before. This is the human heart. It's an animated image with the heart pumping. It's a lot easier to talk about the heart and what the heart does if you have an image that everyone involved can see. But the exact image that you use might vary. The image that's going to add the perfect amount of clarity might vary. So you may not need all these labels on your image, depending on what you're discussing. You might need more information. You might want an image of the whole circulatory system so that you can explain how the heart actually works, how it actually pumps blood around the body. The second thing that I think visuals can do in storytelling is to engage people with a topic, to make them intrigued, to make them interested about a topic, especially topics that they might not have been previously interested in. So there is a line drawing on the screen of the coronavirus against a watercolor background in pinks and purples. And the text says there are many types of coronavirus named for the pointed structures which surround them like a crown. The respiratory illness COVID-19 is caused by a newly identified coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2. I created this image and a series of other viruses as part of a final project on an illustration course that I was doing towards the beginning of lockdown. I didn't think much about it. Viruses were on my mind, and it seemed like a really nice topic to explore. When we got to the final showing, I actually was surprised to find that this image stunned my fellow students and the course leaders as well, because none of them had ever considered a coronavirus or any other virus to have beauty in it before, which as a biologist is something that I'd always seen and I'd always really found quite fascinating and intriguing. And suddenly they all wanted to know more, despite the fact that this was a virus that was in the news constantly at the time. They wanted to know more about the virus, they wanted to know more about the structure, they wanted to know way more than I could possibly tell them. And it was a really nice example for me of how a beautiful image, a striking image, can make people interested in something that they weren't previously interested in. On a similar note, these are a couple of images, so one of a gecko and one of a bat. And they were used as part of a artist residency that I did last year, exploring uncharismatic critters. Again, trying to show the beauty in animals that we don't see as charismatic, that people are less interested in, less engaged with normally. And this was a colouring page in a professional publication, which showcased a conservation scientist, Laura Kaur's research in a very visual way. And then there's text from an interview with her around the outside. The other thing that I think that visuals can do, the third thing, is to motivate people. And for me, the difference between engage and motivate is that to engage someone is they see the image, they want to know more. Motivate is the image with the rest of the story makes them want to change something about their behavior. So I found this quite striking example from Smoke Free Hampshire, which shows a so almost lungs, but formed from dead plants on one side and live flowers on the other side. And it says quit smoking and breathe. It's quite a striking image. Whether it motivates, I wouldn't necessarily know. Motivating images can also be used in marketing. So here are a couple of logos and branding things I've been involved in, both for podcasts. So on the left, we have a logo for a podcast called Challenging Pseudoscience, run by the RI. And on the right, we have a profile of a podcast co-host called Sarah. And it has a profile with different information about Sarah, and then a cartoony style illustration of Sarah. And I did these for all of the co-hosts of the podcast. And the idea for both of these is that the motivation will be to get people to actually then take an action to download the podcast to listen to it. So before I move on, I would be interested to know whether anyone out there sees any other reasons to use visuals in storytelling, something that you've done before or something that you've seen used well in the past. I've also just noticed in the chat that quite a few people drew a clock, which makes me happy earlier. Okay. To simplify a concept, yep, I think that for me that comes maybe under clarify, but I think simplification is really important sometimes too. Thank you very much. See if there's any other responses. To tell experiences of people with health conditions, Paolo, yep, I think that can be a really nice way. To engage more attention of the audience. To share cultural identities. I find that really interesting. But I'd be interested to know if you have a project in mind for that one. To use less wording. Okay, thanks so much to everyone who has shared your ideas there. Those are all really nice examples of how visuals can be used to improve stories. So next we're going to do a bit of a storytelling exercise. And to start with, we're not going to have any visuals, we're just going to work with text. I'm going to give you a series of prompts. I'd like you to get some paper and a pen, or for this one, you can type as well if you find that easier. And I'd like you to write a simple story about your research or your work. So for this first prompt, once upon a time there was, you could complete it with the problem that your research is trying to solve. You could complete it with something about yourself, so it could be once upon a time there was a condition that caused people a lot of pain, or it could be once upon a time there was a little girl who was interested in animals. And once you have your first line, for the second line, I want you to put every day, ... Until one day, because of that, because of that, until finally something happened. So I'll give you another 2 minutes to fill that in. I am being a little bit mean on the timings of things today. But so I'll give you till 12:35 to finish your story. Okay, time's up on that exercise. Now, I'd like you to get a piece of paper, and a piece of paper this time rather than on a computer, and think about that story that you've written. And I want you to think about how you could use visuals to add clarity, to add engagement, to motivate people, or for another reason to improve that story in some ways. I really would encourage you to sketch, to doodle, to draw diagrams, and be visual in thinking about this. But if at this point you'd rather write out your ideas, that is also fine. And I'm going to give you 5 minutes to think about this. So it's 5 minutes starting now. We'll come back about 12:41. Anyone's got any questions in the meantime, do feel free to post those in the chat. So I'd like you to think about the story that you just wrote and think about how you could add clarity, engagement, or motivation to that story using visuals, or how you could otherwise improve that story using visuals. You have 1 minute left. Okay, and time's up. So if you could put what you've just worked on to one side for now, we'll be coming back to it in a few minutes. So next up, we're going to make a really simple zine, which we're then going to use as a place to put some of the stories and visuals that we've been thinking about. So you're going to need a sheet of paper, ideally a sheet of light colored A4 paper, but if you have A3 or you've got something different or lined paper, we can work with whatever you have. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen, and Paolo, if you could swap my face and my desk so everyone can see what I'm doing, that would be really helpful. Brilliant. Or we can have all both on screen is also great. So just give everyone a little bit of time to make sure that you have your sheet of paper. You are also going to need a pair of scissors, although if you don't have scissors, you might be able to get away with tearing along a ruler or even a credit card. I'll show you how that can work later. Just give you a bit of time to get your materials together. Okay, so we'll get going. I will repeat this twice so that anyone who misses any steps can catch up. But I want you to take a paper and fold the short edge to the other short edge. So I've got two sheets or something, like this. And then once you've done that, I want you to open it up and fold back on that fold. So that just makes your crease a bit more flexible. Once you've done that, I'd like you to fold long edge to long edge like this. And again, fold that fold back on itself. Like so. So at this point, your piece of paper should be divided into 4 sections. Now, once you have that, I want you to fold the right-hand short edge into the center. And then to do the same with the left edge. And then open that out and fold both of those folds back on themselves as well. So you should now have a sheet of paper divided into 8 sections. Now we're going to now cut across the middle. I'll show you an easy way to do this. You don't need to draw anything, but I'm drawing this to make it clear. We're going to cut along this line here between those 2 points. It's not that clear, so I'm just going to scribble over it in another color. So this line from there to there. And the easiest way to do this is to fold your page in half again. So the middle, short edge to short edge, and cut along that line. At that point, you should have a piece of paper with this hole in the middle. Once you've got that, you're going to fold it long edge to long edge. So you have a long strip with 4 sections. Hold it upright and push the 2 edges together. So this bit in the middle sort of opens out, and then keep pushing until you end up with a cross shape. And then if you flatten that cross shape and fold it in half, you end up with a little booklet that has 3 double page spreads. I'm just going to do that sort of folding up bit again, because that's normally the bit that everyone struggles with. So you go from your sheet of paper that has a hole in the middle to folding it in half, pushing the 2 edges together, and then folding that cross shape flat and folding it over so you end up with a booklet. So I'm going to show you all the steps again, but I'm going to go a bit faster this time unless anyone posts in the chat that they are struggling with a particular step. So we're going to fold in half from short edge to short edge. Fold back on itself. Fold long edge to long edge, like so. And back on itself again. Folding the 2 edges into the middle. Those back on themselves. And then cutting from the fold to the first crease, so that I have a hole in the middle of my paper, folding it in half, pushing it together, folding it flat, and then folding that in half. So hopefully everyone's with me. If you're having any issues, do post in the chat. So what I'd like you to use your zine for, so you now have a little zine that has 3 double page spreads or 6 individual pages, and you've also got a front cover and a back cover. And I'd like you to take the story that from your previous exercise and break it down into either 3 or 6 main points, or you could do some number in between those. You could use the 6 story prompts that I gave you. So it could be that your first page is going to be once upon a time there was, and you use each prompt until your final page is until finally. You could do something different but inspired by that story. You could decide to throw that story away and do something completely different. But I'd like you to add these to your zine. You're probably not going to finish your zine in today's session, but hopefully it'll get you started on something. You can either plan this out on a scrap piece of paper, or you can dive straight in and start drawing, writing, or collaging into your zine. There's no right or wrong way to do this, but I really would encourage you to use some of the visuals and visual ideas that you came up with. If you really aren't comfortable drawing yourself, you can use images that you found from the internet or elsewhere. Just be careful around copyright if you're planning to share this zine anywhere. So I'd like you to take the next 10 minutes to start working on your zine. We will come back together at 1 o'clock to talk a bit more about adding visuals to other storytelling work and other communication work that you might be doing. If you would like to step away from the screen for a short break between now and 1 o'clock or for the whole of the next 10 minutes, that is absolutely fine. Just make sure that you are back on the hour. Thank you so much, everyone. And if you have any questions in the meantime, do post them in the chat. We'll get started again in 1 minute. Okay, everyone, we'll get going again. So I'm now going to talk through a collection of sort of techniques, programs, platforms, and tips for adding visuals to your work. And that can be work in lots of different formats. So the first thing I wanted to say is that rough and ready can work. You know, little doodles, stickmen, sketches can be really nice and very engaging and accessible ways to add stuff to your work. So this was a sketch from a video I did about whether a bear or a shark would win in a fight. Someone sort of asked me to do this. It had more science in it than you'd expect, but I did quite scribbly illustrations in it, and they were received quite well. So unsurprisingly, coming from me, one of the first techniques I'm going to point out is that you can use drawing to add visuals, and that can vary from a stick figure to something more like this comic that I did about life at the top of London in Enfield, where I live, and about the wildlife in Enfield and how important it was for me during lockdown. And this was published in the British Ecological Society's magazine. And was a very sort of personal story. If you are interested in drawing more and you don't really know where to start, one of the books that I recommend to everyone is this book by Scriberia called How to Draw Anything. And as well as lots of really practical tips and tools and, you know, sort of graphic building blocks for improving your drawing, there's also some really interesting commentary in the book about how we see writing as an important skill that can also be an art form, whereas we tend to see drawing as something that people who are good at it primarily do, rather than something that we could all use to communicate. I find PowerPoint is surprisingly powerful for creating visuals, especially simple visuals and graphics. So this very random scene on the screen, I created using, I think, a graph for the pyramid shape. I added text that says summit and base. I used their icons to add the trees, the dancing people and the fish. And then the blue water and the sun were just PowerPoint shapes. And you can use these quite simple tools to show things in diagrams that might add quite a bit to instead of just using text. And of course, I should note that you can then pull these from PowerPoint. You can export as an image. You don't have to only use PowerPoint when you're using PowerPoint for a presentation. Canva is a web-based design tool that lots of people use for everything from simple graphics to more complicated infographics like these three, which are all examples from Canva. So there's 2 on sugar and 1 on technology and child development. I definitely recommend checking Canva out if you need to do some simple graphic design. If you want to do more complicated graphic design, then there are a variety of different software out there. So there's the Adobe Creative Suite, which includes which includes Photoshop and Illustrator and InDesign. Affinity is the new kid on the block that's sort of challenging Adobe's hold on the market these days. It has very similar software, but it's a one-time payment instead of subscription. And what should also be on this slide is that there's also GIMP and Inkscape, which are free open source versions of Photoshop and Illustrator. So someone's asked, can we get free access to these apps? So as far as I know, Canva is free. And GIMP and Inkscape are free. I will let Paolo answer about Manchester access to other apps. I do know that Adobe's student discounts are quite good compared to their normal rates. Using stock images can be a really nice way of adding some visual interest. There are lots and lots of different places to get stock images on the internet. Generally, stock means that they are copyright free or that they have certain terms of use so that you can use them within their copyright. Unsplash is a website that I really like using because they have slightly more unusual stock images on there. So if you search for storytelling, you get this slightly odd image of a person holding a book over his head with pages raining from the sky, and then you get some pictures of books and a pen as well. And they have lots of interesting stuff over there, and year on year there seems to be more and more images on Unsplash, and other websites are also available. If you are filming videos or if you're speaking in person, you can use props to talk about things, which can also add visual interest. So this image of a blue rectangle with 2 black circles and 2 white circles represents one of the first props that I made in my science communication career, which was a bag with 4 styrofoam balls in it, which I used to explain the randomness in genetic inheritance of certain diseases. And it was something that I used with lots of the patients that I was working in my first job, and actually got the response that people could finally actually understand why they might have a genetic condition that their children wouldn't necessarily have. And so it was a really simple prop, but it was seen as very effective. If you are speaking to camera, you can add visual interest in a whole load of different ways. So for example, by using props. In this one, I went for the slightly more extreme option of painting the human sinuses onto my face whilst I was talking about them, which not everyone has to do, but face paint could be a way for you to talk about your work, or you could find another way of adding visuals to videos. Drawing and speaking at the same time on video can be another way to add visuals to your communication and your storytelling. So this is a screenshot from a video where I was talking about my favorite animal, the honey badger, whilst drawing all the things that I was talking about at the same time. So another nice way to do visual video content can be using time lapses. And this is I still have yet to find a better example of a time lapse talking about someone's research than this one by Emily Fairfax, which is used to explain or show how beavers can prevent wildfires. It's quite a short clip. I'm going to play it now. If the clip didn't play for anyone or you couldn't see it, a very short description is it shows a beaver building a dam across a river. A fire then starts on the other side of the dam, but the dam protects both the beaver and the forest on that side of the dam because of the flooding that occurs. Hopefully that non-technical description does get the idea across. And I think it's just such a really simple and technically simple way as well. You know, I think the video uses card, some plastic toys and some bits of felt, and it communicates the point very, very well. If you're interested in doing time lapse, which you can do with objects, you could do with drawings, with lots of different things. There's some really good phone apps that you can use. I think there are free options, and there's a few that are quite cheap, so just a few pounds, that work very well. And time lapse is also great fun. So if you are interested, I'd recommend having a bit of a play around with it. And then finally, I was just going to say, don't be afraid to work with professionals. I'm not just saying that because I'm a professional illustrator. There's lots of professional designers, videographers, animators out there who are likely to love working with you to communicate about your research, to tell stories about your research. There may be funding available for you within your institution to contribute to this, and also you may produce visuals and things that you can reuse in the future along with your work. And I know personally, I'm always quite happy to work with people to make sure that things are reusable or flexible. So last but most definitely not least, we're going to talk a little bit about accessibility and visuals. Now, I'm going to say I am not an expert in accessibility, and this is not exhaustive, but I think it is important that this is something we should think about when we are using visuals within our storytelling communication to make sure that it can reach as many people as possible. So the first thing to mention is alt text and audio description, which are ways of describing images. So alt text would be used on websites or for social media, and on social media, and quite a lot of websites these days, there's a box in which you put that text in. And audio descriptions would be used, for example, when you are speaking with images in slides like I'm doing at the moment. So I might describe this as a blue rectangle with 2 white circles and 2 black circles on it. And for something like this, that can be quite simple to do. If it was a slightly more complicated graphic like this infographic, it gets a bit more tricky. The idea behind both alt text and audio description is that you should give someone who cannot see the image the same experience and the same information. I say same information rather than same experience as someone who can see the image. So for something like this, you would actually want to write out or speak out all the text on it, which I am not going to do right now, going against my own advice because we haven't got that much time, but you would want to make sure that all of that information is within the alt text or the audio description. Subtitles and captions are really important for videos. Similarly, you could do transcripts for things like podcasts and audio medium. I usually use mixed captions to do my captioning. I know a lot of people who use something called Capwing. Most automatic captioning software is quite good these days, but don't get lazy. Try and check through the captioning to make sure it's picked up on the right thing. So in this screenshot that is from one of my own videos, it says "the found in sub-Saharan Africa" when it should say "they are found in sub-Saharan Africa." So there are often things that you do need to change, and that may be especially important when you're using jargon that captioning software may not be used to. Something that you might want to explore is tactile communication. So communication that can work for those who are visually impaired by actually feeling it. So 2 projects that are really good at doing this are Tactile Universe and Tactile Collider. And I would recommend checking out their websites, lots of information about the projects on there. And I think it's also worth remembering that with lots of these accessibility considerations, they can also mean that you reach people that you weren't necessarily aiming your changes at, but who they help. So things like captioning can mean that someone who hasn't currently got their headphones with them and is watching something on the bus can still watch a video. And similarly, tactile communication might engage sighted people in different ways as well. But I think the main take home I'd say is, if you are in doubt, consult your audience and all those who work with them and talk to them and find out what they need. Never assume that you know what someone's access needs are. So finally, I'm just going to say, if you've got any questions, do post them in the chat and I will answer some of them. As I mentioned earlier, you can find me on the web at hannahayub.co.uk, and I'm also at hannah_sciart. And the image on the right is of my adorable niece reading through a colouring book about visualising dementia research that I created. So Paolo's just said that, for reference, Tactile Collider also involves the University of Manchester, which I should have known. Thanks, Paolo. Okay, so I am sometimes confused about to what extent could we use visual tools when we try to explain our research background, say when I try to present something over PowerPoint. So I would say one of the main ways that you can do this is adding visual interest to your slides. So different people need different things. So there used to be the advice that you should never put everything you're saying on your slides. That advice has now changed, so that actually sometimes you do need more text on your slides, because that might be useful for people who have hearing difficulties. It might be useful for people who don't speak the same language as a first language, and those sort of actual text prompts can be useful. However, for a lot of people, a wall of text can be quite off-putting. And so adding visuals, adding diagrams, photos, it could be photos of you doing your research. It could be photos about your research. It could be any sort of images that, again, just clarify what you're talking about. Make sure that the people in your audience have the same pictures in their head that you might have in your head. I think especially when you're communicating with the public, things like how you do your research, whether that's in the lab, in the field, working with other people, they may have no idea what you do on a day-to-day basis, whereas you might assume that they do know. Sort of going right back to that exercise that we did at the very beginning with this shape. Try and make sure that you're not talking about something that the audience can't see and can't think about. Any other questions from anyone? If there aren't any other questions, Paolo, I'm going to put you on the spot and see whether you've got any.
Apologies, everyone. I was trying to find my mouse in the second screen. I actually would think, what do you think is the best thing, like the key thing that audiences look for when reading, or like, for example, zines about research?
think something simple. I think someone earlier, I can't remember who it was, sorry, posted saying that there is sometimes simplification and clarity can be at odds with each other, that if you simplify too much, you sort of lose clarity. But I think starting simple can be really useful. I think we can often want to convey too much information about what we do because we know everything about it and there's so much that we want to share. But trying to put everything into a zine or into another form of communication can mean that actually the key messages are lost, or that less people engage with the material or pick up the material. And I think trying to, say, use the format of a zine to try and distill something down into, you know, 3 points or 6 points, like quite those sort of headlines that you want to get across, can be really useful for your audience, because then they sort of pick something up and it can be clearer to them what they're meant to be taking away from something as well, rather than having sort of walls of text to read or lots of information. And I think sort of similarly, I love visuals, but at the same time you don't want to put too much visuals into things as well. You know, try and have key images that you are focusing on, so say one image to go with one message. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's amazing. And last question, very quickly, if there was one thing, one tip to give to people who are looking to kind of share their work or research via zines, visuals, what would that tip be?
Ooh.
Ooh.
I feel like just saying use visuals is probably a bit too obvious, isn't it? I would actually say try drawing your ideas, even if no one's ever going to see them, even if you are going to sketch out some ideas and then throw that in the bin. I think that actually putting pen or pencil to paper and creating shapes, or as some people would say, creating marks with meaning, can be a really good way to make yourself think differently about what you're communicating, about what you're creating, and possibly even have you thinking differently about your research itself. Yeah, I think that I sort of mentioned earlier that in the Scriberia book, it talks about this like idea that drawing is an art form when actually it should be a communication tool. And they've shown that for most of us, it's around the age of 8 that we put ourselves in a box of either good at art and drawing or bad at art and drawing. And that's the age when a lot of people simply stop drawing. And actually, there is, not only are there lots of people who think this, there's also lots of evidence that shows that drawing is an important communication tool and an important sort of thought processing tool, and that especially within areas like STEM, it can be very, very important for us to do.
Amazing. Thank you very much.